Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Revolution 1313. And welcome, Biodun, Jeyifo. Everyone present, everyone on Zoom, and everyone who's watching us on live stream. Thanks for joining us. And let's start then. Revolution 1313. That's actually a short for a longer expression. It's the ideas, the manifestos, the conversations, the debates, the conflicts, the contradictions, the confrontations, the actions, and the praxis of worldly philosophers who ignited revolutions. 1313. You'll recall, perhaps, for those of you who've been following the series for a few years, that a few years back we considered calling Uprising 1313 Revolution 1313. But at the time, we preferred the term uprising, a more contemporary term, capturing various forms of revolt and insurgencies and revolutions, rather than the expression revolution, which seemed to connote too much or index too much the modern conception of revolution that was articulated by the historian Reinhard Koselleck, by Hannah Arendt, and others. Today, we're using the expression revolution differently. We're using it to reference worldly or revolutionary philosophers by contrast to critical philosophers situated in the academy. Worldly actors and thinkers, perhaps by contrast to professors or academics who are critical philosophers. The distinction, of course, deconstructs easily. And there are some people situated in a difficult space in between with brilliant thinkers like Stuart Hall or Walter Rodney, who sit somewhere in the interstices. But nonetheless, even if we allow for some fluidity and a spectrum rather than a binary, this 1313 is trying to get at the difference between worldly philosophers situated outside the academy and partaking in revolution versus critical theorists in more academic settings. Now, the origin of Revolution 1313 is an essay written by Biodun Jeyifo, an Illuminati and its acolytes, Critical Theory in the Text and in the World, in which Professor Jeyifo challenges us, me, others, to more broadly challenges critical thinkers, particularly critical thinkers in academic settings, to not, in his words, ignore the countless number of revolutionary individuals and organizations around the world whose struggles, defeats, and triumphs have never been hobbled by critical theory's obfuscation. Now, in drafting the manifesto for this Revolution 1313 series, I've been corrected a few times by Professor Jeyifo as to the exact point or intervention we are making. And that he was making in that piece. And that piece really structures this seminar. And we've worked together to chart that out. So I'd like to start by deferring to Professor Jeyifo to set the stage for this new seminar series. And then I'll add a word about it. But I want to start by giving the stage to Biodun Jeyifo. Before I do, though, I would like to say a few words about our eminent guest. Biodun Jeyifo, professor of African and African American Studies and of Comparative Literature at Harvard University, is really not only our first guest, but also a co-organizer of this entire series with me. Biodun Jeyifo, who's fondly referred to as BJ by his students and friends, is a celebrated and revered public intellectual in Nigeria and the United States, and a celebrated professor. He works on the complex interconnections between literature, critical theory, radical humanities scholarship, and 20th century revolutionary social philosophy, as illustrated in his groundbreaking article that we read for this session, In the Wake of Colonialism and Modernity. His early essays single-handedly shaped critical discourse on dramatic works by Wole Soyinka, who was the winner of the 1986 Nobel Prize in Literature, and his 1984 study of the Yoruba popular traveling theater is viewed by many as seminal in the study of African drama. He has also made signature contributions to postcolonial studies. One of his former students argued persuasively that, quote, no other scholar apart from Edward Said, Gayatri Spivak, and Homi Bhabha is more attentive to the radically dispensed accents or stand of thinking the postcolonial the way that BJ has done. Professor Jeyifo's work can be characterized as pursuing two goals, I believe: championing the case for redistributive justice and fostering intergenerational dialogue between the writers of this generation and generations past. In a 2016 interview, Professor Jeyifo laid out these goals in the following way. He said, "My absolute insistence is that I be taken, I be judged on how consistent I am with my passion for redistributive justice in our country and our world. What interests me is, what is the state of social justice in our country and in our world?" And he goes about fulfilling these goals by exercising constant rigor in his thinking and writing. His work is particularly relevant for our seminar because he uses the traditions within and outside Marxism to offer a critical analysis of our society and to formulate new ways to rethink the fundamental issues of our time. So let me ask you, BJ, to set the stage for the new series, Revolution 1313. And thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much. Yes. Yeah. First of all, I have to explain something to you, something that's a little unsettling for me. Just before I came, I can't see your faces at all, because just before I came from my hotel room, I looked everywhere for my glasses. And Bernard, Professor Harcourt had to call me to remind me. I said, I've been looking for my glasses and they are in this room, I know. So just so you know, it's best if one can make eye contact, but I can't because, so I hope there's nothing portentous in it. So I want to respond to that question by using two parables for thinking, for thought. One is from Aristophanes, the classical Greek comic playwright, and it's from the play The Cloud. And the other is from Samuel Beckett in Waiting for Godot. In the Aristophanes play, we are told quite early in the play, The Clouds, that a new school of philosophy, the sophists, especially under the tutelage of Euripides, who was an enemy, a kind of rival. Although one wrote in tragedies, Euripides wrote in tragedies, Aristophanes in comedies, but they regarded each other as rivals. So especially Aristophanes, every single play throughout his plays, any chance he got at all to pull down Euripides, he didn't let the chance go. So in this particular play, The Clouds, the play starts with this view of Aristophanes as the leader of a new school of philosophy, that's the sophists, which gives us the word sophistry, so you can see where it's going. And he says he's going to send his son, the protagonist, the major character in the play, a guy called Strepsiades. He would send his son to this new school to learn how to argue so that he could get off from paying his debts. He said the sophist can argue out of any kind of difficult situation, if they're entangled. So he sends his son to the sophist to learn how to argue so that he would not pay his debts. But the son turns out and says that his father is too tyrannical. And instead, he learns from and he asks the sophist to teach him how to argue against traditional values, which prevent one from brutalizing one's parents. And they teach him the arguments to give his father a sound beating and yet be consistent with traditional values, which is what happens. And the father was so enraged by this that he then gathered all fathers, all old people in the city in Athens, and they drive the sophist out of town. They burn down their school and drive them out of town. The parable obviously meaning that be careful what happens with new thinking, new ideas. You might think they are to your advantage, but it might actually cause you, havoc. So that's the first parable. The second one, which comes most centuries and centuries later, in Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, that's much shorter and far more, I don't know what, it's about a guy, Pozzo, his name is Pozzo. I don't know if you know about the play. Absolutely nothing happens in Waiting for Godot, absolutely. They're waiting for somebody who's thought to be a big shot, somebody who you have to wait for. We don't know why they are waiting. And while for the entirety of the play, they wait and just stop. What keeps you interested? Because a plotless play, a play which has no plot, can be very, very boring. And one of the achievements of Beckett is that it's not a dull play, it's not a boring play. And that's because they carry out all kinds of comic routines of talking, acting while they're waiting for Godot, who never comes, who never shows up. So the only action that you get in the film, in the play, is when a guy, Pozzo, who is like a kind of slave driver, and who has on leash a guy called Lucky. And as they come on stage, is pulling Lucky, who's on a leash. And then at one stage, he commands Lucky to think. That's how he orders him to think. And that 2.5 pages of the thought of Lucky is the most painful thing to watch, because he's shouting his text, and you can see that he's laboring under physical, emotional, psychological pain as he's mouthing this gibberish under the leash of, again, you have if you watch the play, read it, there are many, explanations that one can give. But what anyone cannot, miss is the suggestion that the compulsion to think can be as the taking of one's life, because Lucky is laboring under this command to think. Is sort of, the gibberish is not entirely, clueless. You can see snippets of material from Western thought, from history, from sciences, from politics, but it doesn't add to anything. And so as this lays out, you suffer with Lucky. And of course, it's an irony to give him his name Lucky, because he's anything but lucky. So I thought to use these two parables to suggest that this is not exactly that is the great investment, but also the disappointment, that can happen to thought, to thinking. I think in a nutshell, Professor Harcourt in his book, it's a wonderful book, takes critical theory, especially of the Frankfurt School, but critical theory in general, to what has gone wrong, what has happened to critical theory, and what can we do about it. And it maps the whole, you have to read the book because it's not only a 600-page book. I think it's the best review of Frankfurt's critical school theory that we have. I think it's by far the best. And it doesn't, even though it covers almost everybody, it does not simplify. It's extremely readable. It's elegant. I don't want to embarrass him, because I'm saying this because I don't actually say all of these things in my review that I'm saying. I say a little bit of it, but I don't say, but I think it's a masterful book in just its detail, covering critical theory. As I said, if you want to get to a handle on the whole scope and the various aspects of critical theory, that's the book that you want. But I think that the indictment that Bernard makes in the book is the following. At one stage, critical theory was on the side of the unity, the fruitful unity between thought and action, theory and praxis. But somewhere along the way, critical theory lost its belief that thought, it didn't stop being brilliant, it didn't stop being productive, it didn't stop, some of the best minds in European and also world thought. But now in a profound pessimism about whether critical theory can be applied, he argues that it should, but it has to go by through what has happened, especially at the end of the Second World War, beginning with the Holocaust, with many other things, which more or less made anybody who could think, especially critical theories, profoundly, dubious about progress, or even the question which is so fundamental to the beginnings of critical theory in Marxism, in Lenin, is what is to be done. At any stage in human history, human society, if you put that question, which was started earlier from Marx, the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, the philosophers have interpreted the world in many ways. The point, however, is to change it. You're not to simply contemplate the world. You're not to simply but try everything possible to thought, to thinking, to change the world. And so Professor Harcourt, for the rest of the book, marks the long view of how critical theory has gone through many detours, finding Lenin's question, what is to be done, very, very, caught in the trap of all the errors, the terrible human cost under Stalinism, under communism, that critical theory has to abandon that Leninist question, what is to be done, but now cannot come up with a question to replace it. And so, and I'll just speak very briefly, since you've read some of it, hopefully you've read it, and I take up his book and argue that actually, while critical theory, in his own words, was missing in action when all kinds of disasters, all kinds of terrible, terrible tragedies, political, economic, social, throughout the world was happening, critical theory was missing. And I said, no, 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 it's not exactly that. That's not what exactly happened. And I then lay out that actually revolutionary thinkers who are not too much caught up in endless questions about what can thought do, how can they do, they were actually changing the world. They completely transformed the world between 50 to 100 years. And I, read my review, you'll see many examples I give. So I said, we must not only look to critical theory to change the world for the better with thinking, with thought. We actually have a whole tradition of those who did, So that's what led to this new series, Revolution 1313. I hope I've
Yes, indeed. Yes, that was a terrific way to launch this. Although you'll have to call me Bernard in this, okay? All right, okay, all right. But yes, no, that was perfect. And so I think that building on that, I just want to spell out as kind of precisely as possible kind of the three questions as I see them motivating this and building on what BJ said. So the first one would be kind of as concretely as possible, what, if any, difference is there between the critical philosopher situated in the academy and the worldly philosopher located outside the academe, with regard to the possible contributions to critique and praxis? Now, I know that, in your formulation, BJ, you don't want to be as blunt as that in a way. You retract that question, you say it's unnecessary. You withdraw that question and you say it's not helpful to choose between Theodore Adorno and Mahatma Gandhi, or between Hannah Arendt and Mao Zedong, or between Foucault and James Baldwin. But my sense is that I don't want to retract that question, because I want to keep that on the table. I think it is at the heart of the challenge, and it's of utmost importance. Because if our ambition is to get beyond crisis and critique and to push critical philosophy further to the question of critique and praxis, then I think we have to ask, what is the difference between engaging the written works of someone like Fanon, or Nkrumah, or Luxemburg, versus engaging the work of someone like Foucault, or Arendt, or Adorno? Is there something about being situated in the academy that matters and differs? Is there something about being, and at times embracing, the identity of the teacher, the professor, of course, from Latin, right? A person who professes. And in these times, it's really someone who professes knowledge of a special kind. Now, many of the thinkers that we've turned to in these 1313s are or were located in the academy. Foucault, Arendt, Adorno, Marcuse, Said, Spivak. Many were not, of course. Beauvoir, Fanon, Césaire, and most of those that will be engaging today are definitely not. Nkrumah, I mean, in this series, not today necessarily, but in this series. Nkrumah, CLR James, Luxemburg, Gramsci. I'm hoping we're going to get to George Jackson. You mentioned Bobby Sands, Nelson Mandela, Nadine Gordimer, Steve Biko, Jose Maria Tegui, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, all very far from the academy. And as mentioned, of course, some are situated in a nebulous zone. Sartre was not in the academy, but came from it so closely. Walter Rodney taught at the University of Dar es Salaam. And Stuart Hall, of course, was a professor of sociology and a academic career. But the question is there something different in those situated positions that means that the contribution to critique and praxis is itself different. And I want to hold on to that question. I don't want to give it up because I do think that that is something we need to ask, particularly as we are situated in the academy right now as we speak. Right? The second question, if there is indeed a difference, how much of it turns on one's personal implication in struggle? And this, of course, raises a complicated question about the autonomy of critique and whether it is even possible to distinguish or delineate critique from praxis, ideas from action. Those are complicated questions. But the point is this, right? If we take the example of Fanon, who I know we'll be talking about a lot today. Fanon joined the FLN, as you all know, when he was in Algeria. He contributed to the underground paper, Al-Mujahid. He was expulsed from Algeria. He moves to Tunisia to continue with the FLN. He's appointed ambassador to Ghana. Was there something about those acts that marks a difference in the resulting work, The Wretched of the Earth? Right? Something different at the theoretical and or practical level. So, we'll be looking at this text. Take, for example, a passage that we could possibly look at in Wretched of the Earth, page 135, 153, 154, where he's actually talking specifically about negritude and the first and the second congresses of Black writers and artists, when he writes, and he says, for instance, negritude thus came, this is on page 153, thus came up against its first limitation, namely those phenomena that take into account the historicizing of men. Negro or Negro-African culture broke up because the men who set out to embody it realized that every culture is first and foremost national, and that the problems for which Richard Wright or Langston Hughes had to be on the alert were fundamentally different from those faced by Senghor or Jomo Kenyatta. Is Fanon's analysis there and his critique, say, of negritude different qualitatively, in kind, from that of someone else at the time who would have been situated in the academy? Because he was outside the academy, or because he had implicated himself in a revolutionary movement. How did those actions make us then and today reread the text differently? Or when he attacks colonialism in the next passage, and writes that in Africa, the reasoning of the intellectual is Black African or Arab Islamic. It is not specifically national. Culture is increasingly cut off from reality, right? We acknowledge, of course, that Fanon, because of his situatedness, has expertise on colonialism that can't be found merely in the archives, but of course, that's a platitude in a way. Of course, he has more experience, right? The difficult question is, does the revolutionary implication of someone like Fanon give his writings a privilege for our analysis today of critique and praxis? And by contrast, that is, to someone located in the academy, the professoriate, the research community, etc. And then the third question, as I see it, is how much of these questions go to the question of critique and praxis as opposed to the question of tactics or strategy? What's the line between praxis, strategy, and tactics? This is a problematic that Sheila Ben Habib, who joins us tonight on Zoom, puts pressure on in her work. In fact, very explicitly. And in her essay on the unity and dissonance of critique and praxis, Sheila Ben Habib specifically emphasizes that the project of pushing critique from crisis to praxis may suffer from a confusion over the lines between praxis, strategy, and tactics. Ben Habib writes that the project, quote, conflates strategy and philosophy, conflates critique and tactics. I take this charge very seriously and anticipate that this year's series, we'll spend a lot of time working out that intersection. The lines are very fluid. They're not bright. And they are often, even intentionally, ambiguated. You'll recall Tony Negri and Michael Hart argue for the inversion of strategy and tactics, right? So they actually argue against pure leaderlessness, taking the position that we should, quote, transform the role of leadership by inverting strategy and tactics, let the multitude decide on strategy, but the leaders decide on tactics. Without getting into those debates, for now, though, in its most concrete form, the question would be, how might the distinction between critical philosophers located in the academy versus worldly philosophers who brought about revolutions help us to think about the space of practice and its demarcation or not from what we might call strategies or tactics? So I want to put out those three concrete questions because I know it'll be guiding my thinking throughout this and our discussions with BJ and others. And I hope that those are helpful. I'll also throw out one preliminary hypothesis very quickly before we jump into our first seminar. It's a bit of a generalization. It's intuitive. All generalizations are wrong. It's very preliminary, but nonetheless, something that intrigues and certainly interpolates me is this hypothesis. Is it possible that the worldly philosophers see things in more stark moral or ethical or political terms? Is it possible that they see things more black and white, a term, of course, that resonates naturally with the anti-colonial struggles we'll be discussing today? I'm thinking here of the difference, for instance, in the tensions between Bertolt Brecht and the members of the Frankfurt School, right? Might it be that those like Brecht, located more outside the academy, tend to be more, well, Brechtian in their view of the world, with sharper distinctions? I'm also thinking here in the early 1970s of the work of critical philosophers like Foucault and Deleuze, who implicated themselves, immersed themselves in social movements. I may mention this later on, or who were in a way engaged in forms of academic revolution, such as the creation of the experimental university campus at Vincennes. Now, that's very far from joining the FLN. There are degrees of gradations and gradations of implications, but at those moments, it seems, they were marked by a conception of the intolerable, as in the Les Enquêtes Intolérables, that demarcated more clearly political, ethical, and moral lines. What was acceptable and what was not acceptable, what was tolerable and what was intolerable. Is that a question of temperament? Does it implicate our levels of skepticism or nuance or resolution? Is it a psychological question? What accounts for the passage à l'acte in some cases and not in others? I'm not sure. But there is something, it seems to me, at least initially, as I approach this area.
I almost can't wait to respond to that.
Ah, great.
To say, I don't
Yes.
think so.
Okay, go ahead.
I don't think so, but not necessarily so. And I'll give you a kind of, story that used to circulate in the German Social Democratic Party,
Okay.
which goes, and it's from Isaac Deutscher. I'll later on send you the reference.
Okay.
And it goes like this. Members of the party all secretly complained, or most of them complained, that they found Das Kapital tough to read, very, very tough. And anyone who's tried to read that Capital of Karl Marx, all the volumes, extremely tough. And so the story went around. Someone said, oh, I haven't read it, but comrade so has read it and has written a summary of it. And the person goes on, I haven't read that summary itself, but the theorist of the party has read that summary and has written a summary of that. I haven't read that one either. But the new, delegate to the General Assembly and has read it and has told me all about it, what it is all about. Meaning that the person who's saying this hasn't read either Das Kapital itself or its various popularizations, which really means that in revolutionary thinkers and activists, they don't reduce, it's not always that they reduce everything to black and white.
Mhm.
They do struggle also. And
Mhm.
Marx is not alone. There's a whole number of others who can read that, whose text you have to struggle with as much as you do with critical philosophers. I
Mhm.
think what happens, the decisive factor in my view, is that critical activist thinkers, revolutionary philosophers, have the almost certain assurance that they will be read. And they will be read by people who have a need to read them. So they make it a little easier. They struggle to make it easier to understand. They don't cut corners. They don't exactly see. I think some do. That's when you get pamphlets, revolutionary pamphleteering, which reduce everything to stark terms. But actually, in terms of struggling with ideas about equity, ideas about between tactics, Lukács has a small booklet, Tactics and Ethics, in which he struggles with this same question that you just read, tactics and I think that's the title. I read it more than, I don't know, 40 years ago. But so I said not necessarily so, because this question also arises. Also, I'd quickly take up one issue which you raised with Fanon, because I won't get into it. So in case I forget it, it's a very crucial point. The one about how critical academic, thinkers might take Fanon's difference with negritude, with Senghorian negritude. There are two critics who are academics. Marcien Towa, the title Marcien Towa, T-O-W-A, and the title is Negritude or Negrologue. Negritude or Negrologue. These are the sharpest critics of Senghorian negritude. And the other one is Negritude is Dead. The burial or the funeral. And that's Stanislas Adotevi, A-D-O-T-E-V-I. Now, the reason I bring them up, they consider the sharpest critics of Senghor and negritude. But they do not have the breadth, the subtlety, the persistence of Fanon, who is not in the academy. So you see the kind of shift around of normal expectations. These are academic, brilliant guys, in Francophone, studies. Towa and Adotevi. At any rate, they have the reputation of being the brightest critics of the sharpest at any rate, but they do not have the depth and the persistence and the rigor of, as you'll see, except in the Wretched of the Earth, in the two congresses, it barely mentions negritude by name. But there's no, as I will show later on, there's no doubt that it's actually going after negritude in ways that negritude never finds the depth of the critique in any other person.
Terrific. So on the last point, I think it would be a fascinating case study, right? I mean, that would give us actually kind of almost a controlled experiment in a
Yes.
way, right? That would be a brilliant other seminar where we could then compare those works. On the first point, I just want to say I wasn't being critical of sharp boundaries in a way. Not that you were suggesting I was, but I just want to emphasize that I wasn't saying that as a critique. I am far more fond of the Brechtian worldview.
Yes.
I confess, and as probably you know from my work, that there is a sharpness, a crispness to notions of the intolerable that I embrace, but I do wonder if, and so it's not a critique and it's not a demeaning, it's not suggesting that it's not rigorous, on the contrary, but I feel as if there's something, and you know, we'll be exploring this all
it's
year.
Certainly something to explore.
Yeah. Last December, we had the brilliant musician Theo Bleckman make a musical composition from certain passages of the Threepenny Opera, this was for Abolition Democracy 513 last year, on the abolition of property. And I wish I could rewind the tape. I'll send you all there at some other time. But to me, that was such a formative moment of kind of artistically representing these rhetorical questions that Brecht poses that are so powerful. Okay, good. All right, so let's now launch into formally our first seminar. As you'll notice in the introductory post that I put for Revolution 113, I placed this epigraph at the top. It was a paragraph from the final resolution at the first International Congress of Black Writers and Artists in Paris in September 56. 65 years ago to this day, actually, was the closing session. It reads, "The generalized abolition of the colonial system and the definitive and universal eradication of racism." And I had reproduced that resolution to mark continuity with last year's 1313, which was called Abolition Democracy last year. And just to emphasize that we are in continuity with the conversation from last year. We are still in this space so powerfully discussed by Du Bois, by Angela Davis and others, of abolition democracy, of the abolition of the punitive society, and in the space of working to achieve a just society. And with that ambition in mind, as well as this new ambition of focusing on worldly philosophers, we begin today by exploring the remarkable conferences and gatherings at Bandung, Paris, and Rome in the 1950s, with a special focus on Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, Richard Wright, James Baldwin, and other remarkable worldly philosophers. And not only looking at their work, but more importantly, exploring the conversation and the confrontation and the contests of their ideas and practices. We're immersed in their debate. And as I emphasized in the introduction, that's not to suggest that they were paragons of praxis or that their praxis was a perfect model. It certainly wasn't. As I noted, there wasn't a single woman who presented a paper at the first Congress of Black writers and artists, and it wasn't much better at the second. So it's not that the practice is always unimpeachable, but this is a space where we can see the articulation and the conflicts and the tension and the development and the interaction of worldly philosophers and their thought. And so that's what we're going to be doing, as Biodun BJ suggests in in one of the texts we have, Inside and Outside the Whale, which we read, Bandung, Rwanda, Postcolonial. It's in Postcolonial Literary and Cultural Studies. He writes, Frantz Fanon's mature political thought, in fact, developed in between the vigorous debates that took place in these two congresses. So let's turn then to that question and to your thoughts on this constellation of the two conferences, the Bandung meeting, and the work that happened during that decade.
Before that,
Yes.
very briefly,
Yes.
there's a more general, which was actually part of your moving to this.
Yes, in the
stage.
introduction,
Yeah.
yes.
Which is the
Go
more
ahead.
general. Oh, wonderful. What actually drives revolutionary theories and activist thinkers? What actually drives them in a way that is clearly discernible from what we might say what drives, academic philosophers.
Right.
And I think I said earlier on that it's because they know they will be read. Other activists, the population, part of the general population will read them. So that's somewhat different from the situation of academic philosophers who are lucky if other academic philosophers read them and if the general population reads them. They are glad for it. Some of them are not, because they might have anxieties about being perceived to be too popularizing. If people understand you, there's a problem with you. If they don't understand you, then you've succeeded. Of course, it's a caricature. But as opposed to this, activist thinkers know almost for a certainty that they will be read. And so that gives them, but beyond that also, I think for me, far more important is the fact that they not only want to be read, they want to contest certain figures, certain members of a generational cohort who are sort of pushing the agenda of, let us say, making revolution. They want to contest that, and it's a powerful drive, powerful urge, which academic philosophers don't have. There are figures who sort of find a way of combining the two, and they are really outstanding figures. But in general, I think this is almost a divide and that's why I use the special term. There's a kind of agonistic drive. That is a kind of contestation. And agonistic comes from the Greek dramaturgical point of protagonist and antagonist. And the root word is agon, which means conflict, contest. So there is a kind of agonistic drive which compels them to write, because they know that present conditions at any point in time are unbearable. There's too much poverty, there's too much suffering, there's patriarchy, and they want the damn thing to be blown up. And so they contest. Fanon also had that in incredible quotient. I will later on, show that how he generalizes from the situation of negritude in Africa to virtually the whole world in the wretched of the earth. He moves from racism and culture. It begins it in racism and culture, but moves on to a more general project in the wretched of the earth. So that sort of leads me to Fanon. And I have to be kind of very summary, very kind of bring in such a huge lot, and I don't have the time and the place, but I do promise that in my longer essay, which will be posted on in about a week or two from now, I will make them much more expanded, and respond to all the things I cannot respond to the present phase. If you look at black skins, white mass, it begins something which will later on morph into several different, go in different directions, which is two things in one. First of all, he uses his own subjectivity, his own self. He is the black skins in white mass. He's placed it between the invisible man of Ellison, who does not want to be looked at, who looks at relations of the look within racism. But at the same time, at one stage, in the same text, he sort of goes through a kind of, taking stock, objectifying himself, objectifying his body, his blackness, and linking it to the blackness of all Black people. I mean, it starts as an intensely painful, embarrassing experience of blackness. It's like the stage, like the personalization of the stage when in the US, if you called any Black person black, you're looking for trouble. This is because before, black is, is beautiful. When the term Negro was actually preferred to black. If you called any person black, you're looking for what? To the time then when there's an embrace of blackness. In that book, Fanon doesn't get exactly to the celebration, the praise of blackness, but he tries. He sees that this is not his own fault. This is not something inherently wrong in him. This is something that he has to objectify. And he does it, but not sufficiently. So it's like at the end of Invisible Man, the invisible man puts invisibility behind him, comes out of living in the hellhole and comes out of the world. But not through a struggle which involves everybody, but through his own kind of learning to deal with his invisibility. But Fanon, does it in Black Skins, White Mass, but not to the point we will see later in his text. Now, if you move from that to racism and culture, he has in the kernel, not in the full-blown theory, but a kernel that is decisive in his work. And it's contained it's been generally characterized as the 3 stages of development from slavery, from colonization to world revolution, more or less. Not just freeing the self, the colonized, but the colonizer as well. The project of getting out of beyond the colonial system. And the 3 stages are, first of all, he says, as a case of generalizing the colonial situation, he asks 2 questions, the 2 questions in one, that no other, I may be wrong, I think I'm not. I don't think any other theorist of colonialism made that generalization. For instance, there's Albert Memmi, who was also a distinguished and influential theorist of colonialism. His 2 books, two among many others, Dominated Man, and then Colonizer and Colonized. Mm-hmm. He also was from North Africa, but moved to France. But Fanon did something. He asked this very simple questions on the surface. He says, what do all colonialists do? What do they do? And speaking for myself, I have not seen a single colonizing nation which does not do what Fanon outlines. It asks, what do all colonizing nations do? And then the second question, which is the counterpart or the obverse of the first question is, and those who are colonized, what do they do? What happens to them? And very briefly, the following things: the colonizer nation must not only colonize economically, must also colonize culturally, linguistically. And why is that so? Because if you don't do that, if you do not colonize them also linguistically, if you do not impose your language, if you do not impose your educational system, your values, your civilization, you will not succeed. And it says it's only modern colonialism which does it. Colonialism did not start with modernity, has existed for centuries, thousands of years. But the decisive difference in modern colonialism is that it ultimately does not involve only, which is what old colonialism did, just extract value and do not integrate the value, the economy of the enslaved completely into that of the enslaved or the colonizer. That's ancient colonialism, with especially under capitalism. Whether you have administrative colonialism, in which you do not have settlers, which is usually a more brutal form of, a less brutal form of colonialism than settler colonialism, which, by the way, is what marks, England, the English empire in West Africa from the English empire in East Africa. But in East Africa, they are settler colonialism. They meant to stay permanently there. Whereas in West Africa, they just integrated the economy, but never settled, did not intend to settle. So it was, So with all of these differences between ancient colonization and modern capitalist colonization, Fanon was able to generalize from the situation of Black Africans, Black, Caribbean people, and Black Americans to what happens with if you look at the colonization of China, parts of China and other parts of the Far East, you'll see that in Korea, they did impose their language on the, the Japanese did impose their culture on the Koreans. And so if you move to Ireland, which is part of the British Isles, which has a much longer history of colonialism than every single thing that happened in the English colonization of Africa happened by way of imposing the culture, the language, the values of the British, of the English on the Irish. So, and Fanon is the first to make that generalization. Then moving to which becomes more decisive, I'm sorry, I'm sort of going over very wide spaces, which I hope to make more detailed in my longer essay. Moving to what every colonizing people or nation will do comprises of 3 stages. And by this way, these 3 stages are a kind of rewriting of Jean-Paul Sartre's stages in the very influential essay of Fanon, Black Office, right, which is an introduction to the volume of poetry by Senghor, Césaire, and others in 1948. So, that's 1948, 1956. So the echoes of Sartre's, Black Office is also hovering over all of these unspoken cross-references between Fanon and Senghorian negritude in the conferences. So in Black Office, Sartre had also used the dialectic of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which is the Hegelian dialectic, and said first stage, which is the thesis, is, if you want, whititude. White civilization imposes itself on black culture, black civilization. In the second stage, the blacks assert their own right to their own values, to their own civilization. But it says that neither will find that they are in the right, that actually culture in human terms is much bigger, more complex, more mixed. And very, very soon, and Sartre got a lot of flack, a lot of critique for making everything so easy that it was like applying the dialectic too mechanistically and not giving enough room to how the things actually get played out. Now, what Fanon does by way of complicating the issues beyond the dialectic in black office, such as black office, is, and this is absolutely crucial, that in many, many cases, stage 2 will take too long. We'll go through many generations. It says it's best if it doesn't last too long, because when it lasts too long, then the possibility of colonizer and colonized liberating each other becomes stymied. And says then you get all kinds of incredible manifestation, cultural, psychological, when nationalism, either racial nationalism or territorial nationalism, which is reacting colonization, lasts too long, because then both positive and negative values of the colonized self become prolonged. People refuse to speak English or French, even when they can speak it. They say, we will speak only a language. And they pose interdictions on different aspects of the colonized cultures and somehow begin to oppose change that is beneficial, scientific, educational, medical, just because it comes from the colonizer. So Fanon warns against that. And I'm in that particular instance, I'm saying, he has in mind negritude. He doesn't mention negritude at all. That's what he's after. That negritude always sort of, by the way, a kind of very interesting dimension. I might want to explore it in my paper, but I may not have space. At a more complex level, we might say both Fanon himself, as well as Senghor and Alioune Diop, and all the others who are speaking for negritude, were both involved in very interesting kind of Francophilia, and at a more general level, Europhilia. What do I mean by this? At the conference, something very interesting, I would not go so far as to say that it's the first time that this has happened with the two congresses in the history of European colonization of the other parts of the world. And it is the following, what I'm calling now Francophilia. One revolutionary, one kind of conservative, which is that in a simple literal sense, what we might call the elite of the French culture and civilization, as well as the elite from Black America, Black Africa, were involved together in this demand for the end to racism, and especially of the left. They were not just the elite, they were the elite of the left, the French left. this never happened with, and could not have happened with the colonization by the Dutch, by not the English. I was born in late colonial Nigeria. I went to school, primary school, a year or two of secondary school, and it was unimaginable and never happened and could not have happened to have the best writers, best professors, I mean, the most elite who are at the top of the rung, but also of the left, meeting at a conference, and it did not happen elsewhere. No, so in a way, the documents which you'll be reading in the two congresses are unique in the history of colonization, in having, at best in the British colonial system, you have members of the Labour Party, not the writers, not the artists, not Picasso, not somebody of the weight of Picasso. Picasso designed the logo for the conference. André Breton was there. I mean, not just the big names, but also of the radical left. In the British system, you are lucky if you get the support of the British Labour Party, and was not always consistent. And definitely, nothing of like the Sorbonne. Sorbonne is like the Oxford of UK. You could not have that so, that's why all of the documents which you get there are worth reading, because it's the first time that a body, a gathering of such scale, asked unequivocally, assented to by everybody present, for the end of the colonial system and racism on a world scale. It was an incredible feat. But however, within it, there was this kind of skirmish, there was this kind of battle going on between Fanon and Richard Wright, and especially Senghor and Césaire. And by the way, the little biographical detail, Césaire had been a teacher of Fanon in Martinique. So there was also a kind of the revolt of the pupil against the teacher. But at any rate, what is crucial about this in terms of negritude is that between Fanon and Senghor is that I said both are different forms of Francophilia. One, kind of radical one, because who was or were the main inspiration for Fanon out of French history, French philosophy, French, art? It was Georges Sorel, violence. He wasn't a kind of anarchist violence of Sorel, but at a time when people were making polite declarations about the need to end racism, Fanon was fixed on these two theories, where the second stage of revolt against colonization was not, Fanon said, not only would it take place, it would happen. And it would be extremely uneasy for both colonizer and colonizer. It did not say it would go on, it would take his move to the wretched of the earth to make the violence literal, actual, uprisings, which would actually involve violence against the colonizer. And he did act it out when he moved in the colonial administration as a psychiatrist. One of the first things he began to do was to link, and if you look at the indices at the end of the Wretched of the Earth, you'll see case histories where he tried to cure people as a psychiatrist. He found out that everywhere he looked, and he documented. And if you look at the film, Battle of Algiers, which also refers to the same process. You'll see that most of those who joined the Algerian revolutions were actually people incarcerated under different kinds of mental and psychological problems. So Fanon distinguished himself. That's why his form of Francophilia is true anarchists and revolutionaries in French history. And whereas Senghor drew his from philosophers, if not exactly conservative, but one big philosopher influenced him was Henri Bergson, who, as you know, had this theory of time and duration. And this somehow finds its way into Senghor's conceptualization of emotion and feeling as what is essential to negritude. He wrote brilliantly. There's no question. Wasn't he at one time a professor at the Sorbonne?
Yeah,
Yes,
so.
I remember vaguely that he was. So, but his construction of what is essential, what is the essence of negritude, was, not 1/4 of a mile, 10 miles from violence, which Fanon was more or less laying out as a necessary stage of transcending and ending the colonial system. As for Richard Wright is an extremely very interesting case. He's the writer of Native Son. He wrote, powerful, using realism, used very powerfully against racism in the US. Was also an essayist who was very compelling in his descriptions of the growth and development of Negro literature. But in the third world, in Africa, at that conference, what happened to him at that conference? When I first read it, I could not stop laughing because the reactions, the reception he got was far from what he expected. He was so blindsided, as you saying, he kept sort of reversing and rewriting his own responses as he went on, because for a Black American to be surprised that religion has a staying power in Africa, in the world, and religion, as he outlines it there, was, kind of very simplistically only a kind of false consciousness, you want, of the worst kind that could persist. He was a member of the Communist Party before he resigned, which means that he had some, was he the one who was a member of the Communist Party? Yes. And then also Ellison. No, it was Ellison, Raphael Ellison, who had been a member of the Communist Party. But look at the role that religion played in the African-American struggles for liberation. It's comparable to liberation theology in South America. And Richard Wright is surprised that people were expressing, positive feelings about religion, the staying power of religion. He counterposes religion to rationality. But Marx famously said, religion is the opium of the people. But people conveniently forget the sentence, which comes exactly, before that more famous quotation of religion being the opium of the people. But he says before that, or right after, but it's the conscience of a world without conscience. something along those lines. Says that, so he sees the double edge of doubleness of religion, that religion can serve as an opiate for the oppressed, but also it is what keeps them going and gives them a strength that they are worth more than religious priesthood, teaches them to be. At any rate, what I want to clarify about, about Richard Wright at the conference is that the fact that he completely misjudged what people would make of his speech is a mark of how far he was distanced from it. It's more or less, it would have been much better for him not to have been at that conference, because he did not see the dimensions, the complexity, but above all, the need to end the colonial system. He did not see it in the same terms in which the negritude is, and Fanon and the more radical, more revolutionary exponents of the need to struggle against colonialism. So, to end it all, this short thing on Fanon, I want to move now to what happens in the wretched of the earth from culture and racism, which is the speech that he gives at the 1956 conference. Now, in the wretched of the earth, something that will become definitely Fanonist, appears for the first time in his writings, in his work. And that is the fact that although he had been critical of nationalism in the earlier speech, he now launches it into the biggest critique of revolutionary critique that we have of nationalism in almost in revolutionary theory in the post-war period up to the present, which is why he fittingly gives the relevant chapter in The Wretched of the Earth, the title, The Pitfalls, at least in the first translation. Not in the second translation, it gives him something else, by the which I don't like as much as the previous by Freshman. He gives it the title, The Pitfalls of National Consciousness. And what he means more or less is that under colonialism, everybody was sort of racialized, continentalized. That is, you are Black or a Negro, not because you come from Uganda, not because it's because you're all Black. And he says that is the basis on which people could effectively fight under colonialism. But when national liberation, national emancipation comes, then you find that what distinguishes or what relates to the basis of oppression and resistance to oppression is not racial, it's national. And then you begin to see all kinds of, and Fanon was nothing short of being prophetic. If you read that chapter and look at the array, the number of, alienating and oppressive developments on the economic, social, above all, ideological levels is incredible. What comes to be known as post-colonial disillusionment of finding that nationalism, emancipation at the national level becomes a kind of trap. And people find it terribly difficult, not only to get out of it, but actually to avoid falling into the trap becomes immensely difficult. That text was written, Fanon died in 1961. And most of the first, well, before Egypt had gotten its independence around 1922. Now, the first Black African country to get its independence was 1957, Ghana. Nigeria gets its own in 1916. Actually, 16 African countries got their independence in 1960. And Fanon died in 1961. He fell very dangerously ill with leukemia around 1959-60, which meant that by the time most of the African countries came into existence, Fanon had done most of his work. But if you look at that third chapter, it is the best compendium that we have of everything that went wrong in terms of the tragic failure of almost all the emancipatory projects around nationalism in the first. So that's why I say that chapter is nothing but prophetic, because it is so detailed. To give one example, Sekou Touré, who became a big name in Black America in the mid-60s for the reason that when de Gaulle gave the ultimatum to all Francophone African countries to either accept to continue to be linked with France, as in the case of the British Commonwealth, all the African countries agreed. Sekou Touré was the only one who said no, and he was kicked out. He was denied, credits. All kinds of punitive measures were taken against him, and he became a kind of hero in Black America, which is why Sekou, what's his name now? He came from Trinidad and took up the name Sekou Touré and went to, blanking out on his name. Because this is the generation which is much distant from him.
Yes.
But it was one of the big name Caribbean revolutionaries who came to the US. He took up the African name Sekou Touré and went to Guinea to, link up with Sekou Touré. So that's why Sekou Touré became a big name, because he was the only one who seemed at first to escape all the prophecies of Fanon in this book, except that he also became a tyrant and ended up very badly. By the way, anyway, there's a play which imagines by a very close friend of mine, a Nigerian playwright, who writes a play about a meeting, a non-existent meeting, a fictitious meeting of Nkrumah, Sekou Touré, and Amilcar Cabral in Guinea. So all of this, I'm suggesting Fanon had seen as a kind of visionary, quality to his critique of ending. At any rate, to round up on this, how to read the conferences, and I'll come to Bandung as a kind of closing bit to this. How to read the two conferences is that it was not exactly, I said, revolutionary Francophilia and conservative. Actually, the conservative at this stage was closer to a kind of liberal democratic framework after colonization. The move to a more conservative one was when Senghor actually became the president of Senegal. And the liberal facade that you see in the call for the end of the colonial system, end of racism, admission that they were sexist, they were patriarchal, all of this vanished when Senghor became the president of, So, but at that moment, at the two conferences, the solidarity between the French left at the highest level and the revolutionaries from Africa, except that the representative of Black America at that conference was not exactly of the most revolutionary because he was clearly out of step with the theory and practice of anti-colonialism, of national liberation, was not part of what we may take from the General Conference itself. Now, to end with Bandung, something which I will go much more into in my essay, longer essay, is the following, which I outlined very briefly in the shorter essay now, is that at Bandung, something very interesting happens, which I will link with something which I told Bernard a few days ago, which is that in the two congresses of Paris and Rome, as I said before, the European left was very, very heavily represented. It was a dialogue and a solidarity, which was very rare, almost rare to the point of being the single one that we have on that scale. In Bandung, Europe was quite deliberately relegated to mere observer status at the conference. They deliberately did not allow the participation of any group, any forces, no matter how radical they were at the conference. They just give them observer status or as kind of ceremony, as I said, invitees at the more ceremonial aspects of the conference. But however, they decided that English would be the official language. And I discussed that in one of the papers that I gave you, which was, and this is long, long before English would become the language, almost universal language of neoliberal capitalism, and become so dominant. This is 1955. And they decide that English would be, because they saw clearly that English, any kind of reactionary or sentimental kicking away from English will become an impediment rather than a justification or a necessary protection of the validity of their own languages. They did provide that anyone who wanted to speak in their languages would provide translations by themselves of English. So you see two interesting things as the obverse of one another. One, limiting the weight of European or Western involvement in the conference, and on the other hand, making a Western language, long before it will become a kind of what is now known as globish, which is global English, the English of the air, of almost everything at the present time. Now, I contrast that, not in the essay which I posted, which is what I told Bernard a few days ago, that one of the biggest names in Frankfurt School critical theory, Jürgen Habermas, was interviewed, and there's a book, I'm blanking out on the book. The book is the only book of that name or title. It's a compilation of the major interviews with Jürgen Habermas, where he was taken up, and the person who took him up on the book was this particular interview was first published in the New Left Review. Then it was published in a compilation of all the major essays of Habermas. And Habermas was the person who asked him the question, was kind of polite and mild, and said, by the way, almost all of the writings on capitalism by the Frankfurt School completely ignores anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, anti-capitalism in the global world. He said the whole critical theory, but you in particular. And Habermas said, I don't write for them. And the person persisted, well, if you don't write for them, but at least you read them. And he said, no, neither, I don't read them. And he admits, I know that this is kind of Eurocentric, but so be it. I've written a long essay, which is so far unpublished. At first I thought I would circulate the section discussing Jürgen Habermas, but I thought not. Well, you know, I don't want, it's not published, so I don't want his first appearance to be before the formal publication. Anyway, but what I make of that in this particular context is that it's almost as if there's a squaring off of the exclusion of Westerners at Bandung in terms of participation, including revolutionaries, anti-capitalists, anti-imperialists from the West. They were not, allowed, as had been the case in the two congresses of France and Rome. It's as if that is now a kind of parallel to the relegation of the West, of Africa, Asia, and the non-West in the world, the project of Habermas, which I suggest at the end of everything is that modern revolutionary projects, emancipatory projects, beginning in the mid to late 19th century, had taken the entirety of the world as the project for all revolutionaries everywhere. There used to be a saying, socialism in one country is a misnomer, that you cannot talk of socialism because the world had become so. In fact, this is the basis of one of the sessions we'll have, which is Lenin, Luxembourg in conversation with Lenin, because they had both had a robust and rousing conversation on what exactly is the world that we want to change. And they're taking very, very interesting, completely opposite, and just summarize briefly, Lenin in Imperialism, the last stage of capitalism, had theorized that extraction of surplus from the West through, workers and the factory system and the production system versus extraction of surplus, which was of the greater determinant. And Luxembourg had said, somewhat laid the greater push for transformation, transition of capitalism, as the dynamic point. Now, whereas Lenin and Bukharin and and others. What's that?
That's it.
Oh.
That's Zoom. No worries. Go on.
Yes. Yes. So that's that's very early, around the first decade of the 20th century, around 1901, 1911. And here you have Habermas in around the late 1980s, saying that he did not care to speak of or speak to the developing world, And it's one of, many of his books carry something linking to humanity in general. That is all of humanity. But he doesn't care to speak to more than 2/3 of that humanity. And so the point of as I said, I say more things. I actually, by the way, I write about this actually in the case of disciplinarity or professionalization of the discipline of postcolonial studies. So it's not, so much on the subject we are on. I just bring it into this instance because the more important point I would want to make is that most of the emancipatory projects of the modern world are defined in national terms, especially in the non-West. They're mostly national liberation for justifiable reasons, except that I'm saying that actually most of the revolutionaries and theorists are theorizing about the whole world. They are not. Nkrumah, who was the kind of pathfinder, was passionate to a fault that no African country could be truly free if not all of Africa was free. He had a vision of a different African Union, as it used to be called OAU, Organization of African, because it is thoroughly saturated and controlled by imperialist neoliberal principles and values. Nkrumah had a different vision of that. So even though he ended up entrapped in Ghanaian national, and if you go and read again that chapter in Fanon, and Fanon died in 1961, he had foreseen, he had prophesied most of the problems Nkrumah would encounter, both caused by himself, his errors, theoretical and practical. And the point that you made earlier about, coming to the question of tactics and strategy come into mind here, because a lot of Nkrumah's problems were as much about strategy and tactics as also by his own failings, his tendency to move towards autocracy, So to end this, point, I want to emphasize again very strongly, since we are actually moving towards, and there's no country in the world that is better for illustrating this. We are moving to terrible times of the spread of autocracy, spread of authoritarian solutions for the crisis and contradictions of neoliberalism, against immigration, against all the threats from the environment. We are moving towards a kind of autocratic, authoritarian, solutions, which are not solutions at all, and so I think it's time we begin that conception of revolutionary practice, revolutionary alternatives, as involving all of us. So it's not when in this seminar, this particular incarnation of 1313, I think we're moving to regaining that heritage of thinking globally, this time in terms of the whole world, not just literally or structurally, in terms of how, in many ways, we are structurally integrated as we have never been before. Absolutely, in the entire history of the planet, we are far more integrated now than we ever are. And so these worldly philosophers and activist revolutionaries who take the world as their territory, actually, although it's a kind of moving back to a heritage which seems now lost, if we look at Habermas, but which actually was never lost, was continued by many revolutionary movements, So again, to end it finally, at Harvard and Cornell, my My students used to say, when I said finally, I would say it about 4 times. So, but this is the final one, which is to say that we have to begin thinking, as I said in my last review, we must ask not just how can I, what
What more am I to do?
What more am I to do?
Right.
And what more are we to do?
What more are we to do?
Are we to do? Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, BJ, for that rich intervention. I know there are many people on here and Zoom who want to get in. I know Rosalind Morris is on Zoom, and Shayla Benhabib and Tuomo Tisala and John Rackman and Mickey Sawyer and Eileen Galuli and others. Anyone who wants to raise their hand. I've got plenty of thoughts that I wanted to get to, which if I don't get to, I will post online. I just quickly, the 3 main interventions that you made, I think, the 3 main interventions are one, that worldly philosophers want to be read and are writing for others. It is this outward-facing dialogic exercise, not solipsistic, that it is intended to be read and debated, somehow, though, in a different way than academic critical thinkers, right? Because, of course, academic critical thinkers, are often in a debate, writing for others, in a conversation, but somehow there's something different about that experience of wanting to be read or to be in a grounded, real conversation, writing for others. That's the first thing. The second is that there is an agonistic element to this, right? In the confrontation with others. And it is in the confrontation with others that there is this shaping of ideas and transformation of ideas. And maybe the third point is the need to focus then on the collective conversation. I call it collective. You didn't use that word, I know, but it's somehow to focus on the way in which the resulting critique and praxis emerges from the confrontation, from the conversation, from the dialogue, from the controversies. So those are, I think, the 3 main interventions. And I agree. I see this. I think these interventions are really well taken. I think that they resonate with current struggles today. I think that they resonate in part with the rise of leaderless, or what we might call leaderful movements in the 21st century. I think it resonates with the critique of what you call the titans, or the focus on the titans of history or intellectual history, which I think plagues not only our thinking, but also the narration of social movements, right? So in that sense, I think it resonates with the rewriting of history that so many kind of brilliant scholars are doing today, performing today. I'm thinking, for instance, of my new colleague at the IJS, Che Gossett, who's researching and writing a new theoretical praxis-oriented biography of Kiyoshi Kuromiya, whose activism spanned from protests with Martin Luther King at Selma to draft resistance to the famous Fuck the Draft poster to Third World Gay Liberation manifestos to ACT UP Philadelphia to HIV decriminalization, legalization of marijuana, and the way in which the ambition there is to understand how the movements and organizers work together, right? And how all of that agonistic at time interventions work together. We just celebrated the launch of a new book in English, the English edition of the JIP archives of the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons of the Prisons Information Group, which also that archive is so rich. One of the most important contributions of that archive is to show how the breadth of the social struggle and all of the people who were involved, and to understand actually how that was made by all the women, men, and queer people who made up the JIP, not just Foucault and Deleuze, but Daniel Rancière, Hélène Cixous, just a host of people who are in some way never highlighted in that history. And so getting to the collective work of critique and praxis is, I think, really important. Of course, we do it in the academic context. Of course, we place interventions within a discourse, within a debate. You can't understand Foucault on Nietzsche without understanding Deleuze's intervention, without reading the conference at Royaumont in '64, which had, Jean Val, Klosowski, Karl Lowitz, Colli and Montinari and others. We do that, but yet we often return in our work, kind of like children playing with action figures, to those singular titans. And so I think it's really important. I think you're right, BJ, for this corrective in a way. And that is the corrective that we're engaging in this year. In a way, right, we need to theorize more richly the interactions, the tensions, the contradictions that produce what is collective thought. That's not attributable necessarily to one person, but to that process itself in an agonistic way.
Although before I forget, this may seem to be a contradiction, but it's not, because as you said in your opening remarks, I had actually pointed out, and I want to emphasize it again, the worst we could do is to pit the two traditions one against the other. And the small point I want to make now is that some, if not most, of the revolutionary philosophers actually read the academic philosophers.
Mm-hmm.
They do read them, which is to say that they are not entirely lost or indifferent to what is produced in terms of sustained complex thought on the world, on human subjectivity. They actually read them. They don't, broadcast the fact that they do, but they do. Especially the most gifted ones. So I thought I would mention that, also not to say that, as I said, in my review of your book, that it's very, very crucial not to separate them into completely divergent traditions.
Right.
Although I make it clear that in my life, and also very briefly, I would add this dimension, that and this is because, and you're not the only one that, in fact, this is done consistently. And this is kind of biographical. I come mostly to the tradition of both the academic philosophers and the activist thinkers from my own work as an activist in Nigeria and Ghana, especially. This is completely excluded from my CV, my official CV, but I spent a large part of my life in the Nigerian Labour Congress as a representative of academics in that labor federation, where I would say, on balance, I have written as much for, and within that context, I was president of the Association of Professors in Nigeria, and it was within that I was a member of the Central Committee of the Nigerian, it's called NLC, Nigerian Labour Congress. And most of the time, I wrote memos tirelessly So, which I knew would be read.
Okay.
Which I then had to put everything in terms of not, as we say, not putting in too much big English, but not simplifying. So
Right.
it took as much out of me as the academic papers that I wrote, that I've written. Although even in that context also, as you may have seen, I also try to, and this is the biggest labor that I have, of clarifying for myself first what I will say in the academic context itself. Right. So I would say this is a base. Okay, the time is going. Yeah.
So go ahead.
No, I just want to say that part of the basis for emphasizing the collectivity, is that I have actually also experienced it in my own life.
Okay, great, thanks. So I was going to bring in Harney and Moten's new book, All Incomplete, because I think it raises fascinating questions about individualization versus this notion of incompleteness. But I'm going to do that later, and if I don't get to it, I'll post it. But I see Sheila Benhabib has a question, and so I'd love to get to Sheila Benhabib. Hold on, Sheila, for just one moment while we make you big screen and make sure that the audio is on. Great. I think you can go ahead, Sheila. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me? All right.
Yes,
great.
very well. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. And I've learned a lot in this session, but I'm also in an uncomfortable position of having to defend thinkers on whom I have worked for nearly half a century, who I feel have been treated unfairly. And since we're talking about the Agon, let me thank BJ for his passionate and profound comments, from which I've learned a lot. I came to this country 3 steps ahead of the Turkish police. I don't talk about this political experience, but many of us who were interested in the work of the Frankfurt School are children of '68. And we were attuned to anti-imperialist struggles. We were attuned to the struggles of the women's movement, ecological movement, etc. So the first thing I want to say is that there is something unfair about staging this conversation as a critique of Adorno, Horkheimer, Habermas, etc. I really want to learn about Bandung. I really want to deepen my understanding of the controversies around negritude. I really want to deepen my understanding of Fanon. And my best students today are writing dissertations about Hannah Arendt and Frantz Fanon. I don't accept these dichotomies. These are not helpful. They are politically deleterious. We have to think in transnational terms. Fanon's thinking would not have been possible without Hegel, without Freud, without Nietzsche. And it's not that it would not have been possible. It's just that we talk to each other. We converse with each other. The Turkish intellectuals converse with Durkheim. They conversed with Nietzsche. And as you say, African intellectuals converse with the other traditions. So we are creating false dichotomies here that are not helping. And in particular, it seems as if, forgive me for being passionate about this, because I think passion is required. Bernard is my dear friend, one of my first students, and his family, right? But why knock down the Frankfurt School and Habermas? So I'm going to say a few more things. The Frankfurt School's pessimism is just a trope. Okay, but one thing that we don't know or we don't think about is that Horkheimer and Adorno, when they went back, Marcuse did not want to go back. When they went back, Horkheimer was the rector of the University of Frankfurt. Adorno became a public intellectual who was the director of the Institute for Social Research, and he would speak on the radio. to a nation that was devastated, to a nation that did not know how to come to grips with its own past. Listen or read Adorno's lectures to the German nation. Now, when we come to Habermas, it's just like everybody is knocking him down one way or the other. People don't know the degree to which this man has been a public intellectual for 30 years, trying to resuscitate democracy and the public sphere. BJ, forgive me if I address you this way. When he says, I did not write about imperialism, people very often misunderstand. There is something about Habermas that is a kind of small d Democrat. He feels that he cannot speak about which he has not had experience and the struggle in which he has not been involved. So the question is whether we can do something with the framework of his theory in thinking about the global world. Does it help us to use the categories of system and life world to think about global capitalism? In my own work, I say it does. So just to conclude, and forgive me this sort of, bursting in, but we are all political people and our theory and our politics are linked and we have to know where we stand. There's no need to create these dichotomies, okay? If somebody in our the dichotomy is between revolutionary third world insurrectionist thinking and conformist first world depressed bunch of Jewish intellectuals who don't know what to do after Holocaust. No.
That is not me.
Okay.
I actually wrote to Bernard to say, don't put this, and I've said that many times tonight, don't put these two traditions one against the other. Okay. And in the case of Habermas, I am very, very specific. I read Habermas. I love reading Habermas, but I will not simply ignore what he said. It's published in the major interviews with Adorno. And he said, I do not write for them, I do not read them. And he's talking about the whole world. And this is 1980. This is not Eurocentrism, it's not Europocentrism. Actually, I think it is more Europocentrism than Eurocentrism, which in terms of the critique of global capitalism is being too centered on Europe itself as the kind of driver. So I am very specific. I try to say, do not make these two traditions one against the other. So all you are saying about me, that's not me. And I even said, please let us avoid it because it's dangerous.
Thank
That's
you,
not
BJ.
me.
Thank you, BJ. Maybe I misunderstood, but Bernard and I, but I'll just say, I really would like to see the citation when he says, I do not write about them. That's not Habermas. I can tell you from many personal political experiences and otherwise, that just is not the case. I don't know what this text is. I'm scratching my head. I'm pulling my hair. I'm trying to figure out what this text is, but please. So thank you. And forgive me for having gone on a little too long.
No, not at all, Shayla, not at all. I mean, thank you in part for an important clarification, but for an important clarification in this sense, the Frankfurt School is not a target in this in this attempt to explore different work. I think, and the use of critical, it's not, and the use of the term critical theory is intended to be much larger than the Frankfurt School whenever it's expressed, which that I know you know from my work, but and it's true that BJ in his article says, oh, no, let's not ask that question, and so talks about the fact that it's counterproductive. But so maybe, and so it's important to understand that it's neither a target of the Frankfurt School specifically, right? When I'm talking about critical theory in the academy, and that I may be going in a slightly different direction than BJ in some of this, but I do think, and in part that's what the topic of this seminar is this year. It is that there is an exploration. We're engaging in an exploration of particular kinds of thinkers, worldly philosophers, right, who are situated differently. Now that doesn't in any way mean that there isn't conversation, contestation, and of course, I mean, you can't. I mean, you know, we studied the last time we studied Fanon in this context, it was in Nietzsche 1313, right? The reason we were studying Fanon in Nietzsche 1313 was to see Fanon's engagement with Nietzschean thought, which is, I argue, all over The Wretched of the Earth, explicitly in many places, as in Black Skin, White Masks as well, right? So we were, and when we did Césaire, it was in the same context. So it's not that there isn't a conversation, right? It's not, and you can't, the Hegelian dialectic is all over this work. So the master-slave dialectic is so influential. You can't, it's not that it's not there, and it's not that there isn't a conversation going on, but it's the question of what can you glean in terms of critique and praxis from thinkers and actors like Nkrumah, or like these more revolutionary actors. What can we find there? And in a way, it's not intended to be a takedown. It's the difference that I'm interested in. And the bringing back into the conversation to a certain extent, because how many seminars do we have at a place like Columbia University, or a place like Yale, or a place like, or your home institution, Harvard, or elsewhere, where the focus is these particular thinkers. In my experience as a graduate student, in my experience as a faculty member, I haven't had that many seminars focused on CLR James and Padmore and just our list of people that we're thinking about here. I don't feel that they are as much part of the conversation as they should be. And the question that I'm trying to explore is not kind of to criticize in any way contemporary critical thought, of which I consider myself a representative of, but to, in some way, try and figure out what are the differences. How does that help us think? Praxis. So I don't want to say. The one thing I did want to say though is, and I'll write about this, so it'll go on the blog. But I really do think that Stefano Harney and Fred Moten's new book, All Incomplete, which we were in fact reading as a bit of a collective with a new team at the IJS, gets at a lot of these questions because it's a critique of individuation in the theoretical and practical enterprise, which, and they take on specifically this conversation, they have a conversation with Amilcar Cabral, another great thinker who, you know, hasn't always appeared in our conversations of contemporary critical theory, right? And is not woven into that conversation very well, I think. His famous speech, The Weapon of Theory, it's right there. It's really, they're having an engagement, Moten and Harney, with Cabral. They're talking about the way in which Cabral, right, told us theory is part of the arsenal of revolution. He didn't say that it was the representation of revolution or a possession of the one who represents. So it's this question of the possessiveness often with which we think about the formulation of critique and praxis, but that we could turn to more the agonistic contestation that produces not just one theorist, but some kind of larger theory. They have this great line, actually it was Fonda in our conversations with others, Lisette Bamenga, Che Gasset, Omavi Shakur and others in Harlem the other night, page 148 of All Incomplete, where it talks specifically about deconstructing the focus on the individual to try and get at this collective conversation that in part we're trying to get at in this seminar, which is why we're also trying to construct seminars that bring together multiple worldly philosophers in one conversation. But I appreciate the corrective, Shayla, because it's important. You know, it's not. There is a way in which it's not constructive to view this as a criticism.
Also, Nad, remember, I myself voluntarily brought in the observation that activist thinkers and revolutionary philosophers actually also read. And she just mentioned one of them whom I didn't want to begin to name them, Fanon. You cannot read Fanon without seeing the range of, philosophers whom he had read. And I said, so I just wanted to point that out.
Okay, let's try and bring just quickly a few more people into the conversation. I see a few other raised hands. Amina?
Yes.
You joining us?
Yes, I'm sorry. My husband in the middle of the talk wanted to go to the beach. So
great. It's a good idea. You're out in California, right?
Yes, I'm out in California. So I'm sorry for the change of location. But I was so energized by this talk. This was an amazing just start of not only the semester, but to thinking about theory and praxis in a different way. I guess my question is, and maybe this is just my philosophy training in me, is that, what's at the heart, at least even thinking about Fanon and these other thinkers, is this kind of essential question about the human, about the I. And, at least in Black Skin, White Mass, the revolutionary reflection started with an existential reflection about, the experience of Fanon on the train being broken into pieces and being unable to recapture this unity of this I that is hallmark to Western thought. And just in this way, breaking with Sartre in a lot of ways and thinking of the self through this experience of the body. And this kind of phenomenology of the body in time. And that, speaking of praxis and theory, it's like what is being captured in both instances is this attention to what is this I that endures? What is this I in this experience? What is this I that's called to action? And in that way, they're inseparable, right? You know, and I just wanted to hear from the panelists and anyone else is that what it needs to be retrieved here in these conversations of this kind of subject that's enduring through both angles, you know, or through both sides of the discussion.
Great. BJ? Thoughts?
Well, in many ways, and this comes out, it's like, this is a slight detour. I don't know anyone who has ever watched the Blacks, who is not profoundly, you know, uneasy.
Yeah. This is Jean Genet's play.
Yeah, Jean
Genet's play.
The same with, you cannot read Blaskin's White Mask and not feeling profoundly uneasy, because it is so deep, it sinks so deep, simultaneously into his own body, Fanon. He doesn't call the subject of it Fanon, but he uses the I, you know, and he uses it both to the self and reflexively in relation to himself through other Black bodies. He focuses mainly on the male Black body. And he got some flack from that because it even continues beyond Blaskin's White Mask into most of his other texts. He consistently, he's not exactly patriarchal, but he doesn't, it's as if the colonial problem, the revolution in the colonies, remember, as I say, he died in 1961, so he did not actually live. He did not live for up to half of a decade in the post-colonial period. And yes, he was so prescient about the problems that newly independent, but not on women, not on patriarchy. So it's not as if I proposed him as a kind of, in fact, it was at the beginning of his writing. And I think actually, but for the force of his writing, that book would probably have been edited, cleaned up, you know, because of just how very much, you know, unreflexive it is in its own terms. So it's not, it's a extremely, I don't know if anyone here has read it. When I say anybody, I mean in the Blacks, no white person, no Black person who watches the Blacks of Genet lives, not just after you've left, being in the theater watching it. He says, by the way, in the preface to the play, he says, you must find a white person to sit in front of, and if you don't, and says, wonders what kind of a person you are, you can't find one white person to stand symbolically for all whites. And the Blacks on stage must play for him. And he says, if you don't find one, then you must find somebody, find a dummy, paint it white.
Right.
And let it sit.
He writes, what if no white person accepted? Then let white mass be distributed to the Black spectators as they enter the theater. And if the Blacks refuse the mass, then let a dummy be used, right?
And by the way, just a footnote to that.
Yeah.
Roger Blanc, who was the director, one of the perhaps at that point in time, the most famous theater director in France, allowed for some time for Genet to come watch rehearsals until one day he had had enough of Genet constantly interrupting the production because he was so much invested in the way that Fanon was also deeply, you know, personally invested in the writing of, you know, that one day they brought in the guard to throw out Fanon from the rehearsals and was banned, you know, from attending any further rehearsals. So what, in short, what I'm saying about, you know, the only way I could fit black skins, white mask into the schema, which I brought, you know, said was that I think at some point he objectifies the black body beyond his own body, beyond the phenomenology of the body, pure black body. It somewhat tries to, which is why I propose the kind of, you know, similarity between the endings of Invisible Man, who loses invisibility. So it's a very, very, you know, problematic in both productive ways and also, you know, kind of deeply, deeply troubling, you know, ways.
Right.
But Fanon this was part of, I think, the greatness of Fanon, that it took on extremely, very difficult, extremely, extremely troubling questions, which is why it was so brilliant in relation to a critique of negritude. Even though most of the time it wasn't, that may be one of the portion you read, maybe have been one of the few instances when it actually names, you know, whereas if you read Adotevi and, you know, the other one, you know, negritude or negrologue.
Joa's piece, right?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so I think we're woefully over our schedule. So I think we probably need to close with apologies to a few other questions that we have, but we're happy to take more questions and comments on our blog, and we'll post them, etc. So feel free to write to ccct@law.columbia.edu with questions and such. I mean, one of the main themes here and in your work also, and in the paper that you're writing that we will post on the two conferences and on Bandung, was that the Black writers and artists who gathered at the Sorbonne, as well as the African and Asian political leaders who gathered at Bandung, were engaged in a radical project to make a new world. And you write about that compellingly. Adam Getachew also writes about that compellingly, drawing on Hannah Arendt's term, the idea of world making.
Yes.
And I see that very much in your work, particularly in what you write about Bandung in your article "Inside and Outside the Whale," which is on the website, and you can all read that. But it's clear that where you write that the nationalism and the national liberation movements had no choice but to be internationalist,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
That's on page 7 of your article. I think this is also reflected actually in Baldwin's essay, Princes and Powers, but it's also very well reflected in the brilliant book by Adam Getachew, who will be joining us for the next 1313, Revolution 1313, on Kwame Nkrumah, CLR James, and George Padmore. That's going to be on October 13th at 6 p.m. right here again, here and on Zoom and live streamed. So I hope you're going to join us for that. It should be a really extraordinary session where we can get into this work more. And for tonight, I really want to first give a special shout out and thanks to Fonda Shen for all of the work and organizing, and anyone can get in touch with Fonda if you want more. And I want to thank Adrian Davila and Reno Mangiapili for extraordinary work on making this all possible, and all the shooting and filming and whatnot. Maybe if you bring us back to our table now, I want to thank especially our guest, BJ, Biodun, Jeyifo. There we go. Yeah, so you didn't have your glasses, but we were delighted to have you. That was a terrific conversation. Special thanks to everyone also who was here and listening, and Sheila Benhabib for your intervention as well, Amina as well, and all of you here. So thank you for everyone, and I look forward to seeing you on October 13th as we turn to some worldly philosophers. Thanks. Take care.